say a little bit about that connection between wisdom and compassion, and then after that we'll get into what we left off with last time, which was a little bit about the mind-only schools, which I had hesitated that I would say more, but then Jody requested that we could continue on with it. So I said, okay, I'm going to try. Seemed a little, I don't know what the word. Maybe it was challenging for some people to talk about tenets, but anyway, we'll go further into that in a little bit. But I want to say a couple things about putting it in context, right? That why, like in other words, because so reminding us actually, because it's good to get in touch with our motivation. Anyway, right? So why does one study from a Buddhist, right? This idea of emptiness, right? Of selflessness, and then from the middle way schools, especially the ultimate view of the Buddha, right? This idea of dependent arising and emptiness. So the question would be, why do we study that, right? So, and that relates back to compassion. So I just have to put it in context again. And so actually, right, in the stages of the path, the Lam Rim, right? In the middle scope, one develops compassion for oneself, right? So wanting to be free from samsara. Right? That's actually the ultimate form of compassion for oneself, right? Whereas when we talk about self-compassion from a conventional point of view, it can be, it can be anything, right? Like, just I have a headache, well, I want to alleviate the suffering of the headache, right? But then that's not, right? That's like everybody knows, right? That gives you, if it works, it gives you relief for a little while, not that long. But then we want to, Lama Zobram often points out, right? Like, just this idea of the middle scope, the renunciation, right? Is like, so sometimes he talks about the oceans of suffering of samsara. That's a metaphor Lama Zopa uses. And then if you contemplate the meaning of samsara from a Buddhist perspective, actually an ocean's too small, right? Because actually an ocean, although we can't measure it, could be measured, right? Like actually you could do that mathematically, right? But actually samsara, if they say it's beginningless, right? In the very first class of discovering Buddhism, we talk about beginningless mind, right? And actually just as, it's actually, like Lama Zopa sometimes says that, he says, the suffering of samsara is unimaginable. Right? He doesn't use that word. What's the word? Inconceivable? I can't remember the word now. But it's like that, right? Actually it is though, because if you think of like just the suffering you have in this life, right? But the idea in Buddhism is that there's beginningless mind. Actually mind is endless, also Nagarjuna says that, right? Mind has no beginning and no end. Consciousness or awareness. I mean, this particular human mind has a beginning and an end. Right? But awareness itself has no beginning and no end from a Buddhist perspective. So that idea, when one's thinking of compassion actually, then just for compassion for yourself, it becomes infinite actually, right? Whereas compassion is the wish to be free from suffering, right? But if you really contemplate deeply the meaning of compassion in this sense, from a Buddhist perspective, then it's compassion in relation to an infinite type of suffering. That's the idea, right? That's what samsara is. When they say samsara, right? In one sense, it's an what's the word? Infinite amount, infinite kind of suffering, or infinite amount of suffering. And then if you contemplate the great scope, right? Mahayana, the bodhicitta teachings of compassion for all beings, right? Then it's, you apply, so that same insight you had towards your own suffering, you're applying it outward, right? And you're saying that each other being, each other sentient being is subject to infinite suffering. That's the idea of bodhicitta, right? And so it's actually hard for the mind to grasp that, isn't it? Actually, I think that if you just try to think of like the suffering of one tsunami, right? Like actually you can't. My mind can't grasp that. Right? If you think of, like, because what does it mean that, like, if they say 300,000 people were killed or something, right? Because actually, like, if I just think of one parent who lost a child, I can barely wrap my mind around it, right? And then if you think of like hundreds of thousands, you can't. It's very hard, isn't it, like, to get your mind around the suffering. So actually, this is not. I mean, we don't have to. It's actually quite obvious that the suffering of others is almost inconceivable, right? Isn't it? I mean, if you actually contemplate just for the news, it's pretty clear, right? And so anyway, so to cultivate compassion, we have to face suffering. That's all. Right? And otherwise, compassion has no meaning if you don't face. Right? Because if compassion means the wish to free others from suffering, if you're not willing to look at others' suffering, of course, then you don't have compassion. And so, so in this sense, from a Buddhist perspective, right, we're looking at like this samsara, right? Like, so the suffering of we call aggregates, right? Like life forms, created by ignorance and by afflictive emotions. Right? So that over and over again, right? Due to ignorance, and this is where we're getting towards the selflessness, right? How does studying emptiness or selflessness relate to compassion? Is that actually right? So when you start to contemplate compassion, the suffering for others, right? The suffering, wishing others to be free from suffering, contemplating their suffering, and then deeply wanting to free them. So then you say, so what is samsara? Right? What is samsaric suffering? So definitely, right, from the Buddhist perspective, samsaric suffering means, right, that sentient creatures, so creatures with mind, right, take on life forms that are conditioned by ignorance, grasping at a self, grasping at a kind of an idea of a self that's a misconception, and then giving rise to so many different afflictive emotions: anger, hatred, jealousy, pride, craving, grasping, and so on. And so do you see how it's starting? I mean, I'm just trying to make this sense. So understanding the nature of ignorance, right, is directly related to compassion, isn't it? Does that make sense, kind of? Or so because actually that's the cause of the suffering, right? That's the idea in Buddhism. That ignorance, grasping at, you can say different terms depending which, but let's say grasping at a wrong idea of how the self exists or what the self is. Then due to that, right, all beings keep taking on these aggregates, these bodies and minds that are subject to suffering. So then the idea, right, is as you cultivate this kind of compassion, then you think, I want to free all beings from that. I want to free myself and others. That's the Buddhist view. And so then it comes to the point where you think, so then I have to realize emptiness. I have to realize that view. And by realizing that, right, then first of all, actually, even if your main motivation is to help others, the first result is that you help yourself, right? And it automatically helps you if you realize that your own suffering decreases and eventually stops, right, through that realization. And that's the idea, right, that realizing emptiness liberates the person who realizes it from suffering. So it's very intimately connected, right? There's the whole purpose of studying emptiness is to liberate oneself and others from suffering. Right? And then also, if you want to help others, right? So like Shantideva says, even helping somebody with just a headache, that's why you took that example, right? Shantideva says, even helping somebody with a headache is wonderful, right? But then he says, so then imagine the benefit of bodhicitta, right? Which wishes to liberate all beings from all their suffering, from an infinite amount of suffering, right? He says, there's no comparison then, right? And we say, actually I think it's hard to conceive, right? I mean that's why bodhicitta is said to be so beneficial, right? So amazing. Can you imagine that wish, right? The real wish where you live your life with that purpose, right? That each moment is to liberate all beings from that kind of suffering. So if you don't contemplate what is that kind of suffering, then bodhicitta doesn't have so much meaning, right? I mean, bodhicitta is different than just like saying, I want to be a nice person. Right? And being a nice person, again, like Shantideva was saying, being a nice person is good, do that. Right? Don't be a not nice person. But bodhicitta is not that, right? Like we sometimes think about, I think sometimes people have this like vague idea. But bodhicitta is not like that at all. I mean, bodhicitta is much more than that, right? It's the wish to free all beings from an infinite amount, right? I mean, actually, just wishing to free one, like if you meet somebody who wants to free you from every bit of your suffering, right? Like just that would be like heartbreaking, right? You never meet somebody like that, usually. Right? Somebody who comes across you and says, that their purpose in life is to free you from all your suffering. Then imagine the person has that for everybody. So it's like they say, that's why they say bodhisattvas are more kind than your mom and dad. Because your mom and dad don't even have the idea to free you from that kind of suffering. They might want to, they mean well, right? But they don't even know about that. So then also, right, by understanding emptiness, right, the purpose really, in other words, when bodhisattvas study emptiness, right, this is what we were getting at with the motivation. Right? So bodhisattvas study emptiness, what's their motivation? It's that they want to, like to go back to the metaphor of a headache, right? Like let's say somebody really has empathy for others' illness, right? Then they go to, let's say they went to medical school, say, I want to be a doctor and help people. Well, because you can't, in other words, you can't do much. If your interest is helping, let's say, people suffering from cancer, right? Well, if you don't have some training, you can't do much to help those people. Right? So the idea with a bodhisattva, right, is if they see, well, the cause of all suffering is ignorance, right? So then they have to go to emptiness school, right? They have to study emptiness in order to understand how do you liberate beings from suffering. Does that make sense? So it's like what's the word? That's the key to liberating others. Does that make sense? So why does one study emptiness? It's in order to, mainly for bodhisattva, a side effect of studying emptiness is they liberate themselves from suffering. But the main reason, right, the main motivation, the main purpose is to liberate others from suffering. Does that make sense? Kind of just from because if ignorance that misconceives the nature of the self is the cause of suffering, and you want to alleviate others' suffering, then you have to help them to be able to realize emptiness, have that wisdom. Right? So you can't really separate compassion. Like, right? The whole there is why bother studying emptiness is compassion. Right? Like, what's the effect? So the motivation is that, and then also what's the use afterwards? Once you've studied, if you've realized it, what's the use of having realized it? Mainly, it's compassion. So then you have something. Then you have a very powerful method to help others. Does that make sense? Kind of like if you understand the idea that if you have to agree with the idea, right? The Buddhist idea that ignorance is the cause of suffering. If you agree with that, right? If you understand, okay, so if ignorance is the cause of suffering, then wisdom has to be the main way you embody and express compassion. Then I want to say one other thing, because actually I didn't address this yet, so I just want to say it clearly so people get it. So I mentioned briefly those three types of wisdom, right? The wisdom of listening or study, you could translate that different ways. The wisdom of contemplation and the wisdom of meditation. I wanted to say a little bit about that because we didn't really get into that much yet. And I want to be clear, like, so from a Buddhist perspective, one absolutely needs all three. Like, and sometimes people have the wrong idea, like, that, like, that those are somehow separate, like, that somebody who studies doesn't meditate, or somebody who's meditating. In the West, there's a lot of things like, oh, I'll just meditate, I don't need to study. That's like a common, actually in the West, that's a very commonly asserted idea. Actually, I'll just share a very brief story on that. I remember once when I was about to graduate from undergraduate, from college, and I was very interested in, I was very enthusiastic about Buddhism at the time. And I went to one of my, a Lama, who was a teacher of mine, and I said to him, oh, really into, I love this Buddhism thing, and I'm thinking when I graduate, he said, what are you going to do when you graduate? And I said, I think I'll go off and do a 1-year retreat. And he started laughing, kind of, and he said, what are you going to meditate on? I said, you don't know anything. And I thought, I thought that was really nice of him to point out. At the moment, I felt a little absurd. I both thought it was very kind of him, and I also felt a little crestfallen, like, oh, really? I read a couple books, like, can I? And he was kind of like, he said, that wouldn't really be much benefit at all. Just waste, just, like like they just sit there spacing. Basically, what he was implying, right? You'll just sit there and space out. That's the purpose of this. What are you going to space out for a year? Like, what's the purpose of that? Because actually, like, you have to understand what to meditate on, right, before you're going to go meditate. Does that make sense? And so sometimes, like, we have that wrong idea, like, where in the West sometimes that, but it's not unique to the West. It's also been true in many Buddhist countries at times. Because you'll read where Buddhist teachers are correcting that misunderstanding, right? Like where somebody will say, "Oh, I'll just meditate," and then but you have to know how to meditate and what to meditate about, right? And how to use the mind in meditation. Otherwise, like, you have this precious life, and then it just goes by. Right? And so these three kinds of, and then also there are sometimes people though who do the opposite, right? Like sort of like somebody who's really into scholarship, and like professor, for example, right? Where they study a lot, but they don't ever meditate, right? And that's not so helpful either, right? Then you can't achieve any kind of liberation that way. So you need all three kinds. So I want to say, and I mean, to some extent, one does them. There's a sense in which they have to come sequentially, but there's also a sense in which one goes through them and goes back to the beginning again. I think some of you here who've been practicing a little bit, you've had that experience, right? Where you study, you contemplate, you meditate, and you realize, oh, I need to go study something else. As you start meditating, and that's one of the challenges if you haven't studied much, right? Like, that's, I think, what that teacher was pointing out to me. I thought, well, I've been studying for a couple of years now, right? And what he knew is I'd go off to the retreat, right, and then I'd be like, you come up with a funny question, if you don't have somebody to ask, then what do you do? Right? If you really try to understand the nature of your mind. Yourself. And so the idea here would be that, to some degree, though, you have to study some, right? So the wisdom of study is when you're actually, whether you're listening to somebody or you're reading, right, where you're really engaging with the material, right? And you get these like moments where you go, oh, wow, like now I understand something new, or oh, that's interesting. Now, now I see a connection there, right? We all have those experiences if you study some, right? Where you're studying something, you're reading about, you're reading a Dharma book, or you're listening to a lecture or something, and you have this moment where you go, oh, wow, like that's the meaning of compassion, or oh, that's the meaning of something related to emptiness, right? But so that's just the first step, right? That's an insight, right? But then what's sometimes we also skip over the middle one, right? The wisdom of contemplation, right? What that is, because actually when you're reading a book, let's say like you're reading a book and the author understands something, hopefully, right? And then you're reading what they said and you go, oh, wow, you have this moment, right? Actually, if you notice your mind, if you introspect, I've had this many times, like, so if you introspect, you'll see what happens, right? There, you're gaining an insight through their power, to some extent, right? Through the power of their words, right? Same thing if you listen to like a great lama, right? Definitely there come moments, if you really are paying attention, there will come moments where you go, wow, like it almost feels like you have the taste of some realization, like you can taste something, right? And that's definitely, if you listen to like great teachers, that'll definitely happen, right? If you really pay attention, right? Because you'll be following what they're doing is they're sharing their own inner, through their words, right, and their demeanor, they're sharing some of their inner experience. And you'll have this moment where you're like, wow, like you really feel something different than you've ever felt before. It's amazing, right? But that's still through their power, right? It's through the power of their words, through the power of their expression. Does that make sense? And that's good. That's the first step, right? But then what you have to do is go contemplate, right? So you take their words and what you've learned, from the books, from the lecture, whatever, and then you go and you sit and you think, right? And you have to make it, like you have to integrate that into your own experience until you have an experience of that through thinking. Does that make sense? Through contemplating, right? So you heard a lecture, you say, now what did it mean? And then you start raising your own objections, right? If you really do it sincerely, contemplation, right? It means like you would start to say, well, okay, they said this and that made sense at the time, but when I was in grade school, somebody said this, and my buddy said that, and my friends say that it's better to go out to a bar on Friday night than to contemplate emptiness. I don't know, what do you think? Like whatever, like use whatever, you have to raise your own objections. You see what I'm getting at? And then you contemplate, okay, the Buddha said this, other people say that. You can also say like other spiritual traditions have a different view, right? You have to keep contemplating, and then it's up to you, right? But so the contemplation part is using reason and experience. Does that make sense? Your own experience, and then logic, reasoning, until you come to a clear conclusion for yourself about the truth or lack of truth or particular teaching, right? And there's that famous verse, right, that the Buddha said, don't trust this because I said it, right? Rely on your, what was it? It said, like, be like a goldsmith, right? And they say, who cuts, burns, and what's the third thing? Tastes, maybe? I can't remember. There are three things that goldsmith does in ancient India. It's gold to make sure it's real gold. It cuts, and maybe it's taste. I can't remember. Burns it, but anyway, but that's what the contemplation should be, right? You should compare it to your experience and to reason, and to your observations of how things work, right? Until you come to your own conclusion about the truth or lack of truth of that. Does that make sense? And when you have and that's a long process, right, of contemplating it from many angles also, right? If you're really contemplating it seriously, it has to be from different angles until you come to some kind of decisive insight about that. That's already quite a lot, right? In other words, now you've studied, right? Then you've contemplated over and over again from different angles, you've raised your own objections, then you come to some decisive insight. That's quite transformational at that point, right? But that you haven't yet started. Then there's the third kind of wisdom, which is the wisdom that arises from meditation, right? And there, what you do is that once you come to that conclusion, right, which has to come through the power of your own thinking, then you focus your mind on that, right, single-pointedly. You're not focusing on your breath, right? What you're focusing your mind on is your own insight, right? So let's say you have an insight into impermanence. Right? You really, through contemplation, you get some, not just intellectual, but you get a kind of visceral sense of how things are impermanent, right? Well, then what you're doing, you have a habit of seeing things as permanent, right? But you're holding your mind on that insight about how things are impermanent until it starts to change how you actually perceive the world. And that only comes, there is that change of perception, and a sustained change, right, in your way of relating to the world arises through that process of meditation. And one thing I want to say too about meditation is, like, so, we can all have some of the wisdom of meditation, right? We start you contemplate, and then you hold your mind on it for a little while, right? So you don't just lose the insight. You have an insight, right? But then you try to hold it there in your mind to familiarize yourself with it, right? Because everybody knows, I've said that in the class before, right? The Tibetan word for meditation is familiarization, actually, right? So you're familiarizing your mind with that insight so that it starts to change your way of perceiving and relating to the world. And ultimately, also, then one wants to eventually, if you actually want to achieve liberation or enlightenment, then I want to say this too. I'm just giving this is just information, but it's worth contemplating a little bit or knowing. Is right. So then ultimately, you have to achieve calm abiding, right? Which is the ability to focus your mind single-pointedly for as long as you want to on any given object, because then you can fully, deeply transform yourself. And actually. And so calm abiding, right, is actually just, what's the way to say this? There's I like the term Bob Thurman's term, inner technology of how do you get calm abiding, right? So the Hindus and Buddhists have a common understanding of that. It's not unique to Buddhism, right? That there are, usually they describe 9 levels, right, of meditative concentration that you go through. Each one is a deeper level of concentration than the previous one, until you achieve, right, it starts off with just, actually, it starts with what we just did, right? You're focusing on your breath, right? And if you do that regularly, you'll be able to focus a little bit longer. Right? And at that point, maybe you've reached the 2nd level of the 9 levels of calm abiding. Right? But imagine that there are lots more levels you get to, right? Until eventually, at the actual level of calm abiding, right? There's a level before that where you can focus your mind still already for as long as you want. Right? But there comes a point where your body actually, both your mind and your body change and become what they call physical and mental pliancy and bliss, right? Your body becomes blissful, your mind becomes blissful. And pliancy means you can apply it to whatever you want. Right? So there actually comes a point where, and actually if you meet great teachers, they're out there, you can see this quality in them, right? Where they don't need sleep anymore, their body's very light, and they can continually do things. They can continually get their mind and their body to do whatever they want it to, right? For us, right? There comes a point, let's say you're trying really hard to focus on something, then you're at a point where your mind, I know I reached that point, my mind's no longer useful. Right? It comes to a point where you can contemplate, and then you go, I can't think anymore. If you achieve this level of calm abiding, your mind doesn't do that anymore. And neither does your body. Does that make sense? So if you want to go do something virtuous, your body and your mind are pliable to do that. And so if you achieve that calm abiding, right, and then you use that to meditate on emptiness, right, that's the method to actually liberate yourself from samsara. So does that make sense? I just wanted to kind of give a little overview of the method. So that's it. So before I switch, I just wanted to, that's an overview of why we're studying emptiness. Right? And then I want to ask people, do you have any, before I move on to talk about the mind-only schools, specifically at Jody's request, does anybody have any questions about that, just about that general? Okay. So then we'll talk a little bit about the mind-only school. And so just to be clear, right, the mind-only school, last time I talked a little bit about tenets, right? This idea of different philosophical systems in Buddhism. And so there are 2 main, 2 major tenet systems, or schools of thought in Mahayana Buddhism. So one is the mind-only school, and the other is the middle way, or the Majjhima middle way school. And historically, the mind-only school is said to have been opened up or sort of first explained after the Buddha's time in India by a Sangha. The Buddha himself taught it, of course. But it was sort of explicated by a Sangha and his half-brother, Vasubandhu. And then the middle way school was the person who kind of opened up that explanation or founded that school of thought in India as a school was Nagarjuna. And so so this mind-only school, right? Actually, from a Tibetan perspective, or from Tibetan schools' perspective, it's they would argue that the mind-only, all Tibetan, all the great lamas of Tibet agree that the mind-only school is not the ultimate teaching, not the ultimate view of the Buddha. The middle way school is the ultimate view of the Buddha. It expresses the ultimate view of the Buddha. So you might ask, well, then why study the mind-only school? Right? Why not only study the ultimate view of the Buddha? And actually, I think I can think of two different answers. I mean, one answer, sometimes they say, Tibetan, an Indian text say that the Buddha taught the mind-only school, first of all, for certain kinds of trainees. So that's one answer, right? For certain people, the mind-only school is still a more useful way to think than the middle way school for some people. Because actually, it's interesting when you say, the Dalai Lama often points this out, right? He says, what's there to say this? Like what school is highest, right? So in one sense, right, if you ask like Lama Tsongkhapa, right, if you said to him what school is highest, he clearly says the consequence, the Prasangika, the consequence school among the Madhyamaka middle way schools. Right? But then if you ask the Dalai Lama, which is highest for an individual person, then it's maybe a different question, right? In other words, because if that's not useful for that person, then it may be the highest school philosophically, in other words, if one uses reason, right, then that would be the one that's most consistent and most clear and most definitive in terms of his explanation. But if somebody's not ready for that, then so what? It's just because something's correct doesn't mean we're ready to use it. We may not be suitable to that. That's one issue. The other issue, and they say this in Tibetan tradition, and I'll say I think it's quite a good, I think it's very useful, is even if one wants to study the middle way school, actually, it's not so easy to understand. And actually, if you can understand the presentation of the mind-only school, and it'll help you to understand the middle way school's presentation. For sure, actually, it'll help you. If you're really serious about studying. Does that make sense? So that's another reason to study it, is if you really want to study, they often say that, like they'll say, that's why they study all four tenet systems. They say they're like stairs, each one subtler than the next. Because otherwise you won't really understand. Lama Tsongkhapa often says things like that. He'll say, he often takes this kind of, he's very, if you read his actual text, he's often quite direct, right? They'll say things like, for example, they'll say, everybody in Tibet says that Tantra is the fastest path to enlightenment. He says, but if you haven't studied it, how do you know that's true? He said, then it's a meaningless words, basically, right? And he says the same thing for the consequence. He says people say, oh, I'm a middle way consequence follower of that school. He says, but if you don't understand what the other schools present, how do you know you're a follower of that? You don't even know if you are following it. You don't really know the meaning of it as compared to these other schools, right? Which makes some sense, doesn't it? So that's another reason to study something like the mind-only schools view of emptiness. It hones your understanding of the issues that the middle way school then was also dealing with. And you can understand the profundity of the way they deal with it if you understand how profound this school's system is. Does that kind of make sense? So, okay. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about the mind-only school from their own perspective, which comes from, the Buddha taught this in the Sutra Unraveling Thought. That's where the sutra this comes from, mostly. There are many sutras where the Buddha taught the mind-only school, but he taught it very profoundly. And Lama Tsongkhapa relies a lot on that sutra when he's explaining the mind-only school. But so in that sutra, the Buddha talks about 3 natures and 3 non-natures of all phenomena. And so I thought I would just do a little introduction to that idea of the 3 natures and 3 non-natures. So we'll just start. And so I'm going to start with the 3 natures, okay? The first nature, right, I'll call it nature, because is other-powered natures. Actually, maybe I'll name all 3, and then I'll describe what they are. So one is other-powered natures. A second one is imputational natures, or imputed natures. Imputed, what does that mean, right? It means like labeled, right? Like labeled by words. And then The third type of nature is thoroughly established natures. So other powered natures, imputed natures, and thoroughly established natures. And so I'm going to just describe now a little bit. So what's an other powered nature? So an other powered nature is, first of all, it's an existent thing, right? Something that exists. And as the name implies, right? It's a compounded phenomenon, right? It's a compounded thing, right? It's a thing that exists, and other powered means, right, that it didn't arise from itself; it arose from other factors. So, what's an example of an other powered nature? Your body is an example of that. Right? Your form. It exists, right? But it's not self-arisen. Right? It arose in dependence upon other factors. The chair you're sitting on would be an example of an other powered nature. It's an existent thing that arose from other factors. This room, that's an example of an other powered nature.
So you can't say all phenomena?
No, you can't say. I'll say why. One is because not all phenomena, like take these, they're uncompounded phenomena, right? And one example is space. So space didn't arise from, empty space didn't arise from other factors, right? So it's uncompounded. It's not made up of parts. From a middle way school, you could say it's made up of parts in the sense of directionality, but it didn't arise from causes and conditions. Another would be another example of an uncompounded phenomenon is emptiness. And so emptiness would not be another powered nature from this school's perspective. Another example of an uncompounded phenomena are abstract concepts. So the idea, for example, of beauty. As an idea, that's not it's not arisen from causes. It's not a compounded impermanent phenomenon. It's just a concept. Actually, these are examples of imputed nature. Now I'm jumping ahead, but so not all phenomena are compounded. Does that make sense? So all compounded phenomena are other powered natures.
Okay.
Makes sense? And also, another thing is just because we talked about this in other classes is, so other powered natures are existent, right? I already said that, but they're conventional truths. They're not ultimate truths. They're conventional truths. Truth means an object of knowledge, right? So they're conventional objects of knowledge. They're not the ultimate truth. We'll get to the ultimate truth in a couple minutes. I want to say something else, though, about other powered natures in this school's perspective, because this is going to be important in terms of, like I said, part of the benefit of this is understanding the middle way school for us, right? So other powered natures, right? Like, take the example of the chair, the floor in this room. In this sense, they are inherently existent. Does that make sense? So they exist from their own side, in a sense. We'll get to what that means, but the middle way school would say they're not inherently existent. This school says they are inherently existent. So it's just a difference. I'll leave it at that. Or they're not. The middle way school says they're not truly existent. This school says they are truly existent. They're not the ultimate truth, but they are truly existent. Okay, so that's other powered natures. Now it starts to get more interesting, I think, next step. I'm going to next talk about imputational natures. That was the second type of nature I brought up. So this is complicated, right? Imputational natures, right? First of all, they're also imputational natures can be either existent or non-existent. I think that's an important distinction, so I want to explain what that means. Like if I say that's a purple pillow, purple and pillow exist. Right? So that's those are imputations, right? But they're existent. Does that make sense? If I say, oh look, a sky flower that's falling on Mike's head, right? I just imputed something, right? I made up, in other words, I gave a word to something, but it doesn't exist, or it's non-existent, right? I made it up. It's not real. Does that make sense? So you can create it, I mean, so an imputational nature, meaning a label, right, can apply to existent things, right? If I say that's Asley, that's an imputation, right? But we can, everybody say, oh yeah, that's that. And so I said, no, I thought her name was Ashley. No, I thought it was Azalea. No, I thought it was, then there are a lot of different imputations, right? But still, so that's an imputation, right? But it's an existent imputation. But this becomes important because if I say there's a permanent, right there, I see a very permanent, substantially existent, independently existent Gabe. Well, that's a non-existent. If I say that's Gabe, that's an existent imputational nature. If I say that's a permanent, substantially existent, independent Gabe, I just made that's an imputation, but it's not. But it's a non-existent one because there is no permanent Gabe. Gabe's impermanent. There is no independent Gabe because Gabe's dependent. Does that make sense? So so this is an important distinction. That's why you see why it becomes an important distinction. There are both existent and non-existent imputations, because sometimes we impute things onto something that are valid. Sometimes we impute things onto something that are not valid.
Is that really the distinction? Is that one is valid and one is invalid?
Well, actually, a better way to say is one exists and one does not exist. That's in this school's perspective. You would say one type of imputational nature or existent phenomenon is an existent phenomenon. The other kind is non-existent. That's actually a better way to say it. Sorry, a good question. That's good. Yeah, so one kind is existent, the other kind is non-existent, right? So like just as the sky flower falling on Mike's head is totally non-existent, it's an imputation that's of a non-existent. It's a non-existent phenomenon. Right? There is no sky flower, so there is this imputation, but it's a non-existent phenomenon. Also, the permanent Gabe is a non-existent phenomenon, so it doesn't exist at all. So that's the difference. Whereas the other one, if I just say that's Gabe, they would say that's an existent phenomenon. It's a conventional truth. Does that make sense? So I kind of want to slow down now and address something, a problem in how I just presented those two ideas. I said earlier, right, when I talked about other powered natures, I said examples of other powered natures are your body or the chair you're sitting on. There's a problem, which is I used words. Right? I was already imputing. Wasn't it? I'm just noticing. Right? I want us to notice that together. Right? Actually, when I said an example of it makes sense. On the one hand, when I say an example of a other powered nature, right? So something that arose in dependence upon, that's compounded, right? And that arose in dependence upon other factors is your own body. On the one hand, that makes perfect sense, right? Your body is something that arose in dependence upon other factors. On the other hand, if I'm different, now we're talking about imputational natures and other powered natures. Right? But when I say, or when you think, when you have the thought, even if I weren't saying it, right? When you think my body, right? Well, you've already imputed, haven't you? And this gets a little subtler, right? Even before you have the thought, the conscious thought, my body, right? Still, when you look in the mirror, when you look in the mirror, right? When you're brushing your teeth this morning, you may not have consciously had the thought, my face, my body. Right? But through habituation, right? On a kind of, what's the word? Unconscious or habitual level, in a sense, you're imputing that already there, right? Whereas even if you don't consciously think my face, when you look in the mirror, you think my face. In a sense, you're naturally perceiving it as my face. Does that make sense? Even if you don't use the words. because you've used those words so many times, right, that's there in your way of perceiving. When you look in the mirror, that's there in your way of perceiving. Does that make sense? Or when you see your friend, that's there in your way. Even if I don't say, oh, there's Fidel's body, right? I don't use I don't always use those terms, right? But that's there in my way of perceiving Fidel's body. Does that make sense? And so,
Can you perceive without imputing?
can you perceive without imputing? From the mind-only school's way of presenting things, that really gets at this next point about the thoroughly established nature. So let's explore that and see. But let's really explore that question, because I think it's a very good question. Right? So let's look at the thoroughly established nature. It's going to start to answer that question, but I think that's a very profound question. Right? So what is the thoroughly established nature then? And so, first of all, the thoroughly established nature is emptiness, or all emptinesses. And so, and I want to go through this because this is important. There are two different types of way of emptinesses, actually, explained in the mind-only school, and they're related. In other words, by realizing the first, it helps you realize the second. Okay. And this is I think it's very profound, Jeff's question, so that's why let's really explore. So the first type of emptiness, I'm using, I want to be specific, I want to be careful with this. I'm going to use the Lama Tsongkhapa's way of defining it. Okay? And think about, when I say other powered natures now, just to help you understand it, let's use the example of a body, okay? Because that's we already said the bodies are other powered natures, right? They're created by other factors. They're not self-arisen. So, other powered natures, that first type of nature, like a body, are not established by way of their own character as factors imputed in the manner of entity and attribute. I'll say it again, but I'll finish the sentence and I'll go back. And then it says, this absence is the emptiness or the selflessness of phenomena. So I'll read it again. I just wanted to say that. I want to finish the sentence and I'll say it back. So, other powered natures are not established by way of their own character as factors imputed in the manner of entity and attribute. This absence is the selflessness of phenomena. Want to hear it one more time, or should I explain it? I don't want to start explaining or analyzing it or looking at it. I'll read it one last time. So, other powered natures are not established by way of their own character as factors imputed in the manner of entity and attribute. This absence is the selflessness of phenomena. So let's just try to look at that a little bit, right? Just together, a little bit. And in reference also to Jeff's question. Right? So, what that is implying, and so I just want to look at this for a moment, is that ordinarily, right, and this is the tricky part, ordinarily every single time we perceive an other powered nature, right, which means, and Gabe hinted at it, which means most of the stuff we see, right, not everything, but almost everything in our daily lives, right, the place you work, your friends, your enemies, your body, your clothes, your house, your car, right, those are all other powered natures. Those are all things that arose due to fact. Right? We are always, right, perceiving those as if they exist out there as by their own character, right? Now I'm using the same terms that Lama Tsongkhapa used, right? That we are always, all the time, every moment actually, we're perceiving those objects as though they exist out there, and by their own character, right? By their own nature, right? By their own character, let's call it, right? As factors imputed in the manner of entity and attribute. So that means, entity means, right? What is entity? So what does the word entity mean, right? Like it means that thing in and of itself, right? It's so you look like Jeff wakes up and he looks at his face, right? He always has the beard, right? Right, and he said, "That's my face," right? Actually, if it didn't have the beard, then it might be like frightening almost. Or something. Who is that guy? But so you look at you look and you see, right, my own face, right? Like so. So the entity, right, is that unique thing, right, and that has many attributes. Does that make sense? And the attributes can be things like impermanence, right? That's an attribute of a phenomenon. They can also be other projected qualities, beauty, youthfulness.
We still talking about Jeff?
No. It's changed now.
No, beauty. That's it. It's like that. Right. So all these. So like actually though it's true, right? In other words, that when we like you look at the chair, right? What is that? I was gonna say red, magenta maybe. What color would you call it? What's that? Maroon. Maroon. Okay, maroon. Right. So now like so the entity, right, would be chair. Yes. Right? Chair. And then an attribute might be maroon. And so I just want to go back to this phrase, right? Established by way of its own character as factors imputed. So this becomes tricky, right? Because I think it's starting to explore what Jeff's question was, right? Every time, as soon as you see the chair, right? All the time, right? Continually. There's never a moment where we don't do this, ordinary people, right? When you perceive the chair, you perceive, right, it to be established by way of its own character as chair and as maroon, for example, in that example, right? Or in Jeff's case, as face and as beautiful. Right? I'm just giving an example of an entity and an attribute. Right? And all the time, we perceive it as existing by way of its own character as the factors imputed. Right? And the lack of it existing in that way, as what's imputed, is its, as Lama Tsongkhapa says, is its selflessness or its emptiness. Should I say the second kind of emptiness, or is it already, or is that too much right now? I'll say it, because if you're already confused, I'll get you a little more confused. That's okay. That's okay, because we're entering into the mind-only school, and it's not easy. Okay? The second kind of emptiness that comes, and actually realizing the first helps you realize the second. So I'm going to say it because I think it's useful in terms of really analyzing Jeff's question, which should be everybody's question to some extent, right? And there's like, what does that mean? You know. So the second kind of emptiness, and again, I'll read it carefully. Apprehended objects, right? An apprehended object, and the apprehending subject. Does that make sense? So subject and object, right? Like there is something is perceiving something else, right? So apprehended object and apprehending subject, and I'm doing this on purpose with my hands, right? Are empty of existing as different substantial entities, distant and cut off from one another. Wow. Whenever I think of subject and object, I have to think like this, right? There's a subject and an object, right? There's me looking at, I think, right? It's natural. Whereas, and getting at Jeff's question, right? This is natural. This is not something intellectually created by a philosophical system, right? I mean, even a cat actually has that, right? If you throw a new toy in front of a cat, right? Maybe the cat goes like this, right? And you can see in its demeanor, right, that it has a sense of apprehending subject and an apprehended object, and I'm going to get that object, right? You watch a cat, and you know it has that, right? You can see it just as we do, right? Like you put, you do anything, right? Every object, right? There's a sense of there's the apprehending subject and the apprehending object out there, and always they seem to exist as what's the word? Separate as different, two different things, right? Not the same entity, but two different entities. And what this is saying is, they're empty of existing as different substantial entities. So you as a perceiver and the chair as perceived are empty of existing as different substantial entities. Wow. That's like, seems impossible, right? So by realizing that the chair is, so actually, let's go back and see the connection now between these two, okay, just a little bit. These are hard points, though, by the way. Like, actually, it said in Tibet that many, Lama Tsongkhapa points, actually, many Tibetan masters misunderstood these points, so I'm not going to pretend I fully understand. But they're interesting for contemplation, right? Because what we're trying to do is move, right, from the wisdom of listening to the wisdom of contemplating, right? So okay, let's stay with the example of the chair, okay? So you're sitting in a chair, right? So again, a chair is an other-powered nature, right? Because all these emptinesses have to start with a basis. The basis is the other-powered nature, right? So okay, so a chair is an other-powered nature for sure, right? It arose, it arose because a company made it from all different parts, right? And then somebody purchased it for the center and brought it here and stuff, right? So and then we say, yeah.
Why is it not one of the other natures?
Well, so first of all, the thoroughly established nature, right, is an emptiness, and so a chair is is not an emptiness; it's something you can sit on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not what's there says, and if it were, so actually, what we're trying to differentiate now, this is a good, I mean, again, it's a very good question, right? Is how do you differentiate the other powered nature of the chair from the imputational nature of the chair? That's what we're starting to explore now.
Right.
And what's tricky, though, in this school is saying the chair does exist. The chair does exist, right? And it exists inherently. And it's truly established. But it's not established from its own side, right? It doesn't have it as its own character, the entity and the attributes imputed upon. Right? So this is getting, and now it's getting, you guys are, your question similar to Jeff's, right? In a sense, it starts to get to this territory. So what's the chair? Right? I mean, this is what Jeff was asking in a way. So what's the chair without entity and attributes being imputed upon it? Is what we're starting to wonder about, right? Which is good. That's a good sign. If you're starting to wonder that, that's a good sign because we're starting to contemplate that. Right? And so it should be a contemplation like that. So let's keep going, right? Let's keep going with this, right? So the chair that was made by a company is another powered nature. I'm asserting, right? Because it arose due to causes and conditions. We're going to get at a subtle level of causes and conditions in a little while too, but I don't want to get too deep too fast. But so if we assert that's an other powered nature, right? So it is not established then by way of its own character as factors imputed in the manner of entity and attribute. Right? So it exists, right? It's an other powered nature. But it's empty. Let's go through each of those. I just want to separate out entity and attribute, okay? So let's first say entity, right? So it exists, right? Due to other, and it arose due to other factors, right? And I'm imputing chair, right? That's an imputation. That's a word. Right? But it doesn't exist by way of its own character as chair. Right? Does that make sense? That's what an entity would mean, right? Or face, when Jeff wakes up and looks in the mirror, right? Face exists, right? It arose due to, for sure we can say this is obvious, right? Whereas that Jeff's face is dependent, right? Dependent on him growing up, having parents, eating, drinking, so on, right? So it's a dependent nature in that sense. Does that make sense? Like, in that sense, it's dependent nature, right? Because it depended on his parents. But then, it doesn't exist by way of its own character as a referent for the term face. Now let's look also at attributes. So I'll stay with this, and we're talking about just face. So it doesn't exist by way of its own character as a referent for the term face. It also doesn't exist by way of its own character as a referent for the term bearded. That's an attribute. The chair doesn't exist by way of its own character as a referent for the term maroon. In one sense, if you start to think about that, it's clearly true, isn't it? On the other hand, and this gets, I think, at your question, like, we never perceive something, actually. In other words, all of our perceptions are infected, in a way, by naturally seeing the object as the referent for our terms and concepts and attributes, right? And what's tricky is that we've never had a perception yet where the object didn't appear as if it were the referent of terms, concepts, and attributes.
What if you see something, you just have no idea what it is? I mean, you're still, in some way, your mind is still trying to make sense of it and applying existing concepts to it.
Or if you posit the first perception of some object, and go to the beginning, right? Go first perception of something unknown.
And what part of
it's
what's
not labeled, because of that, it's not labeled by the label you understand now. So what's that labeling process?
And one thing, like, from this school, again, from the mind-only school's perspective, their view would be, right, that, how do I say this? Like that, that was why I used the example of the cat when you throw the object down in front of it. That what they would actually, one Geshe who's interviewed by Jeffrey Hopkins says something like this, that due to what he called beginningless familiarity with labeling, right, that as soon as a sentient being sees an object, even if it's not at that time, like a baby or a cat or something, where it's not verbal, that there's the habit of perceiving subject and object as separate substantial entities, and there's the habit of perceiving that object as existing and established by way of its own character, as a factor imputed in the nature of entity and attribute.
It's non-verbal, non-name imputation.
Yes.
Is what it comes down to.
Yeah.
But just prior to language, prior to conceptual language, it's just the labeling is other.
Yeah.
That's really
Right.
conceptual.
Other. Yeah, it might be as simple as an instinctual sense of otherness, right? That's still an imputation.
So are the mind-only schools saying that the chair inherently exists, but not based on the labels that we impute on it?
Yeah, let's explore it. So why don't you say that again? Let's go through each word, because that's what you really care about.
That the chair inherently exists, but not by the labels that we impute upon it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the chair inherently exists, right? But it doesn't exist in its own character, right? So or as what we impute on, let's say. And then they're using this other term, right? Yeah, so that's fair. And also, an implication of that, this is the tricky part, right? I want to get to the second kind of emptiness thing, just following on what you said. So keep what you said, right?
Okay.
And then add on. So and therefore, and an implication of that would be that apprehended object and apprehending subject are empty of existing as separate substantial entities.
So the object is apprehension, without an subject and object.
So that, like the dualism of subject-object, right? Of a separate subject and a separate object is another kind of false appearance. False.
So that all exists there is the act. The apprehending act is the only thing that exists.
All that exists is the act. I'm just trying to think what that means. All that exists is the apprehending act.
There's a subject,
Sure.
there's an object,
Yeah.
and they are not different. So then,
Well, actually, let me address that in a way that, because I'm not sure. I can say my own opinion, but I'm trying to be cautious because I don't want to say too much of my own opinion because I may be wrong. And so I want to go back to explore this further, like what the masters of the tradition say. Right? What they would say is that the way they would frame that question or look at that is this: is so ordinary, like an ordinary person sees another powered nature. And they perceive it as being existing by way of its own character, as the factors imputed in the manner of entity and attribute, and they perceive it also as being existing distant and cut off, right, separate from the subject, existing in that way, right. What they say, right, is that by meditation, by contemplating these teachings, right, eventually, right, one realizes. Lama Tsongkhapa would actually say, because the other Tibet masters didn't understand some part of this, the connection between those two kinds of emptiness, actually. This is a unique contribution of Lama Tsongkhapa, actually, is that, well, Lama Tsongkhapa said, from the mind-only school perspective, right, that the meditator, right, recognizes how, I'm taking the example of the chair, right, that I ordinarily perceive the chair as existing by way of its own character as the basis for my imputation of entity and attribute. And then there comes a point through contemplation where I realize that it's empty of that. It doesn't exist by its own character as the basis of imputation of my entity and attributes. Right? That's not its character inherently, or they don't use the word inherently. That's not its own character. And actually, this is an important point from Lama Tsongkhapa's point of view. That realization, right, that it's empty of being that, remember I used this term in the first class in this series, is a non-affirming negation. What that means is I'm just realizing it's not that. Right? I'm not realizing any positive phenomena at that moment. I'm just realizing an emptiness. It's empty of that, right? So an emptiness at that moment. Okay? And if I keep contemplating, then I also would realize it's empty of existing as a separate substantial entity, subject and object are empty of existing as separate substantial entities. Again, this is important. That's a non-affirming negation, right? From Buddhist philosophy point of view, which means when you realize that, nothing's appearing to the mind except that emptiness. Not nothing at all, but nothing other than that emptiness. Does that make sense? So, in other words, for the yogi who's meditating, right? I'm meditating on that other power. I'm taking the example of a chair, and I'm in retreat. Okay. Appears like it's existent as the basis for my imputation in entity and attribute. Right? That's its own character. Right? It appears to me as if that's its own character. I'm contemplating. Then it comes a point where I experience the realization. I'm just giving an example. Right? That one experiences the realization that it's empty of existing by way of its own character as the basis for such imputations. Right? So at that time, just that emptiness appears. Right? Then I continue meditating, right? And through that first realization, I eventually have the experience of realizing its emptiness of existing as a separate subject, the emptiness of subject and object existing as separate substantial entities. Right? Again, at that time, all that's appearing to the mind is emptiness, right? An emptiness of existing as separate substantial entities.
Does that just mean independent?
In this case, separate. I mean, really, they use the term separate in this sense. It doesn't exist as a separate substantial entity from, that the object doesn't exist as a separate substantial entity from the subject. That's the mind-only schools. The middle way school might use the term dependent there. The mind-only school uses the term separate or different.
But is it synonymous? I'm trying to figure out, I mean, is it saying basically that it's the same thing, like we are chairs?
Well, we'll get to that in a minute. No, it's not saying that, but we'll get to that in a second. Because this is getting it. Was that?
It's the act.
Well, let me use the term they would. Let me see, and then you tell me if it is or not, because I don't know, honestly. Right. So at that time, the yogi is just having the yogi's perception is just of an emptiness, right? So at that time, they're just perceiving an emptiness, right? Of an emptiness of difference, right? They perceive things as they had a perception of different substantial entities. Then they're having a realization that difference of substantiality doesn't exist, and that's all that's appearing to their mind. Then they arise from that, and this is what, remember at the very beginning I said this is the mind-only school, right? So I want to use that term, right? When they arise from that, then they perceive, right? How do they conventionally, they arise from that experience of emptiness, right? And then it said that's when they have the experience of cognition only, or of mind only, that all things exist as mind only. Or as cognition only, right? So does that?
Which is what I mean by the act.
Okay, so that's what you mean. Yeah, because that's I want to use that term and then say because that's their term.
All that's there is the thought.
Like the perceptions.
And yet it's tricky, right? Because there's, and yet they still would say that the chair exists and it exists from its own side.
But then if you go through it, how does it exist? It only exists in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, as the same, and an implication of that, I thought it was interesting, Jeffrey Hopkins points out that the implication of not existing as a separate substantial entity is that it exists as the same substantial entity, right? He points out, Lama Tsongkhapa emphasizes the lack of different substantial entity because he's emphasizing emptiness, right, which is a non-affirming negation. But of course, when you arise from that, and again perceive, then you're perceiving them as cognition only. So does that get at the same thing? Yeah, you feel like it gets. It's hard for me to. It's hard. Again, it's tricky language for me. So
it's hard because you start with a valid basis, right? I mean, you start with the chair.
Yeah. In this term, they would use other powered nature. Right? Yeah. So you start with an other powered nature chair.
You have to start with the thought that originated in somebody's mind of the chair. So, if we're looking at, and I may be like going off in left field here, most things we see, the chair, lamp, they had to originate in a thought, correct? So, is the thought of something that's going to make light or something that we could sit on, and then it manifests as the chair or the lamp in the mind-only school, is the thought of the object and the object the same?
No, this is
I
where.
understand my own question.
Yeah, I think let me try answering it and see if this gets it, or tell me if this. Then ask it again, okay? After I try answering it, because I'm not sure I'll answer it correctly. Because I think it gets, because your question to me is leading towards an important point here, which is something that I said I would get to, and now's the time, I think, which is this, remember earlier I said dependent, when I was talking about dependent natures, I said, in one sense one could use the term dependent in the sense of that a chair was manufactured. But from the mind-only school's perspective, there's a more important, which I think is starting to get at what you're asking about, there's a more important level of other poweredness, or of dependence, in the mind-only school, and that's this. When you ask from the mind-only school's perspective, where does a perception of a chair or a lamp, what's the main cause for that perception? What they say is it's karma. It's a karmic seed in your mind. So from their perspective, right, they would say, and there was that a karmic seed for a perception of certain kinds of experiences was planted previously. And then when that seed, that karmic seed ripens, it ripens in the simultaneous experience of a subject and an object. So a lamp and a perceiver of a lamp, or a chair and a perceiver of a chair. Right? So the main cause is not, so it's an important distinction, right? So it's not, from the mind-only perspective, they would say, like, that's why I said earlier, right, they're a non-existent imputational nature. So they would say, just if somebody says, oh, there's a sky flower falling down, that doesn't make it true, that's a non-existent. They would say, because there's no karmic cause to perceive a sky flower, so you're just making it up. Right? Whereas they say, like an existent, first of all, so an existent other-powered nature, right, has as its cause a karmic seed to perceive that. Right? And then there's, let's say it. Let's just say it. So, I want to make sure I'm saying it the right way. So take the example of a chair, right? So, like if, okay, yeah, actually, in the example of a chair, actually, that's a good example. So I'll say it this way, like, so if we hadn't practiced some sort of generosity in past lives, right, then there wouldn't be the appearance of chairs here for us to have and use. So it's a good karma. In other words, it's positive karma to have chairs. In essence, right? So through a karmic seed of having had generosity in a past life, now there's perception of having a comfortable place to sit. And then the issue is, so there's, and due to the, what's there say? So due to that karmic seed, right, there's the there's the experience of a subject and an object as separate and cut off, as I was saying earlier, right? Separate, different substantial entities. And there's the experience of imputation, right? The word chair, color magenta, maybe gray for color, labeled gray for the term gray for the legs and so on. So it's an important distinction that just the term itself doesn't make the object appear. Does that make sense? There needs to be a seed in the mind for that object to appear as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but I want to at least raise that because I think it's on the same territory. But does that answer the question, or is there more to it?
I'm having a little trouble with the mind-only school, and so I'll work through it.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's not an easy. It's not an easy topic, but
I believe she was, though, asking whether the way in which the chair came into existence was based on a thought of a chair in the first instance. Is that
Not I thought of a chair specifically, but just sort of a,
functional thought?
yes, I'd like to make something to sit on that's a little more comfortable than a rock. So I have this idea of a seat and a back and legs, and so to me, that would be where the object started.
But that's sort of prior to this analysis, I think.
Yes, I think I'm about 5 paragraphs
I
behind.
think it's a different analysis.
Yeah.
Sorry.
yeah,
Go on.
no, it's an interesting point. And so I guess I just want to raise a couple more thoughts just to think about, right? Like, so I guess one thought I think is useful to contemplate, and I hope it's coming, and I think it is coming up from the questions people are asking, it seems like it's coming up for everybody in different ways, and part of what's I think very useful with this is to really contemplate what is that. I want to start with those things, right? If we look at the two kinds of emptiness, right? What does it mean when it says empty of being established by way of its own character as factors imputed in the matter of entity and attribute? Like, I think, first of all, that's very useful, I think, psychologically and practically from a practice point of view, right? In other words, what does it mean that I'm always perceiving things as if they exist from their own character, or established by way of their own character, that's what I would say, as factors imputed in the manner of entity and attribute? And for those of you who have studied the middle way school, you can even ask, what's the difference between that and merely labeled? Because it's not the same thing. And actually, that's where it really gets profound, right? Because you say that's not the same meaning as merely labeled. But if you can't understand the difference between that and merely labeled, then you don't understand the unique fact. Right? This is what Lama Tsongkhapa is implying, right? If you can't, which I'm not sure I can understand it, but if we can't understand what's the difference between being established by way of its own character as factors imputed in the manner of entity and attribute, and what's in the consequent school, middle way school, called merely labeled, if you can't understand the difference between those two, then what does it mean? That means you don't understand the consequent school's unique contribution, right? Isn't that clear? I mean, that's logical, isn't it? Because it's not the same, right? Because they're still, if you can realize, right, that things are not established by way of their own character as factors imputed in the manner of entity and attribute. And Lama Tsongkhapa was very clear. You have not yet realized that. If you realize that, that doesn't mean you have not yet. You're a follower of the middle way school, and you have not realized the middle way school. You're a follower of the mind only school, rather, right? And you have not realized the view yet of the middle way school. So he's saying those are clearly different.
I know, this
How are
is
they
exactly
different?
what
To me,
I'm...
they are other words for the same,
Right.
exact same insight.
Yeah, what's interesting here, right? Because here, right, not established by way of its own character as factors imputed in the manner, entity, and attribute, right?
Existing from its own side.
Here, though, they're not saying, here you could still hold the view, they still do hold the view, that the object exists inherently, just not as what I'm, right? In an inexpressible manner. That's the one term that's sometimes used. The chair exists in some inexpressible manner from its own side. The middle way schools, that's an object to be refuted. You see what I mean? So there's a difference. You see, I mean, that gives it some flavor of, there's some difference experientially for these two, a yogi of the one school and a yogi of the other, right? You can see how a person in the middle way school would say, so the chair doesn't exist as I used to perceive the chair to exist, but it does exist from its own side in some inexpressible manner.
So it has qualities, it's just qualities that aren't known to us.
I don't know. Qualities starts to imply, again, it's hard to say. I mean, what I'm wondering is,
the attribute part of it, I guess,
because if I say qualities, for me that means that I start to think, well, it goes back to then imputed in the matter of attribute, right?
Right.
Yeah, so right. So this is a great point to contemplate, though, right? So that, in other words, because I think it gets at what you were saying, Jeff, too, right? You were using that word, what, experience or perception? What was the word you were using? Like
Action.
Well, the last part was just, the action was just the unitary.
oh, no, yeah, but the earlier one you were saying
Perception.
perception. That was the term you were using. Like that there is perception, right? And is that perception truly existent? I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. It's just interesting to contemplate. To me, these are interesting things. Like, if you're really trying to differentiate what's the view of the middle way school versus this school, those are things one has to, I don't know, wonder about. I guess.
Well, Lauren, what's the answer?
I wish I do.
Come on.
I wish I did.
Deal. Agree with you.
And I guess to go back to, what do you think? If you contemplate this, right? This idea of, from the mind only school's perspective, right? This idea of subject and object are empty of being separate, substantial entities. And then sometimes just to be descriptive, they'll use the descriptor then of distant and cut off. So like you look at a snow mountain in the distance, or you look at the Capitol building, right? Actually, if you're driving by DC, right, and you look at the Capitol building, for sure there's this experience, right? I mean, there's an implicit, I mean, even if you're not thinking it consciously, there's always, right? It's there, right? So I'm over here in my car, and there's the Capitol. Like, over there, distant and cut off from me, for sure, is the Capitol building, right? Clearly, this is experience as if it exists as some separate, different substantial entity from the perceiver. Right? And what they're getting at, I just want to say this too, like, because I think your term is good about perception, because part of what the mind-only school is getting at is also is asking us to analyze more deeply than we ever have before, probably. So what does that mean? We don't ask, what does it mean that I'm perceiving the Capitol building? And ordinarily we just think, well, that means I'm over here, and the cowbell's over there, and it's white, and it's capital, and it's the dome, and right, all these other, whatever, terms. And this is asking us to analyze more deeply what that process is, isn't it? I mean, definitely it's asking us to do that for sure, right? In our own experience. And then to sort of use logic to analyze, to deconstruct what's the certain aspects of that experience that are not, that we think are true that are not true. Yeah, that's one more question. I'll just use one more example, and then we'll stop with this analysis. But, like, so Jody, you know, what's the color of the wall? Or what's the color of the wall here? Is that
corn silk?
Corn silk? Is that it? Is that it? I don't know. What's the color of the wall? I don't know. Corn silk? Is that it?
Yellow.
Corn. Yellow. I would have said yellow. I would have said yellow, but I'm ignorant about such things. So I have somebody more knowledgeable than myself. I don't know anything about such colors. But okay, so put aside even the word wall for a moment. Okay, we're skipping that because we've already kind of looked at chair, wall is similar. Right? So I just want to ask you, like, corn silk, right, or yellow, for ignorant people. Like I'll use the word corn silk. Like so, like let's just take the idea of a patch of corn silk color. Like, so now we're forgetting even any of the, like, whereas before we were looking at things like chair, so we would have been wall, right? I'm skipping that, so I'm just getting to much more basic, right? So there's, okay, so corn silk, right? A patch of colored corn silk. So first of all, does a patch of color, if you look at that wall, right? Can you see how it appears to be established by way of its own character as a factor imputed in the matter of entity and attribute? And how it appears to be that apprehended object and apprehended subject appear to you to exist as different substantial entities. And so it's an interesting question, right? So does corn silk, so like it appears as if it actually, like, I'm going to say this, right? So I'd never heard this, I must have, when you were doing research on walls, but I don't remember having heard the term corn silk before. Right? And yet, like as soon as Jody said that, right? I'm asking us to each notice our own mind, right? Jody gave us the term corn silk, right? And now if you look at the wall, right? If you look at any of these walls, does it appear as if, oh, that's corn silk? What does it appear?
They don't look yellow anymore.
What does it look to you now?
Corn silk.
And what this school is saying, right? So that is empty of being established as corn silk by way of its own character.
Is that because it has to do with light and vibrational speeds and all that and how our eyes perceive it? Like there isn't really anything there that color. It's an effect, it's an illusion.
Also can't label itself.
Or is that not what they're getting at?
Well, actually, I mean, just stay with that though for a moment, right? Like, so you're saying, so actually, like, if you stay with, I mean, they're not talking about light waves particularly, but let's stay with your, you're using Western terms, right? Which is fine. Just stay with that for a moment, right? So then in what sense does corn silk exist? Because corn silk does exist, We're not, nobody's, I mean, especially in this school spirit, nobody in the world is saying corn silk doesn't exist, right? That's not the point. But in what way? And so, what they're saying, right, is that, let's take that as example, right? I'm going to talk about the second kind of emptiness now, right? But that corn silk doesn't exist as a separate substantiality from your mind, right? And actually, if you think about it, from what you just said, right, like, that's clearly the case, isn't it? Like, in other words, there is no corn silk that exists as a separate substantial entity from the mind. Right? So then, let's just take that example. So is corn silk mind only? I'm asking it as a question. I'm not saying that's, like, Jeff, you
It occurred to me, this is not exactly on topic, but if we all had separate eye receptors, consciousness, separate physical receptors, we might all be seeing something different than what we're calling corn silk. It's not quite on point, but
No, but actually they address that issue in this school. I mean, the school has to address address that issue of what do you call it, like solipsism, and it's not that's one of the debating points, right? Is in relation to the mind only school is in what way then is it not solipsism, which is not because of the emphasis on karma, for example, and other things. But it's an interesting point, right? That's an important debating point in relation to this school is how does the school avoid that criticism of it just being, because there are shared perception, right? Like this issue of that we're talking about corn silk, and yet it's an interesting question, right? Like, for sure, there are actually, I mean, depending on our eyesight, we are perceiving it differently.
we may all be perceiving different color
Yeah.
that we're choosing to call corn silk.
Yeah. But Jody, is that again? That like, I mean, again, whether they use those modern terms or not is a different question. But that is interesting, right? There was that idea that I mean, that's a fairly easy way to get it. I mean, what you were raising to me, it's not the exact same thing, right? But it is a pretty easy way to get at. If I'm just taking the example of corn silk, right? Like that, I really am perceiving it. When I just look, I really am perceiving it as if corn silk's out there. And yet, it's undeniable, actually, that corn silk doesn't exist as a separate substantial entity from the mind, right, a consciousness. So it's not that hard then to get to the point of so corn silk is mind only. It's an interesting example, isn't it? Like it's not that hard to get to that then.
Because we're actually seeing paint
Right. But again, as soon as
Also a
Jeff said,
concept.
with an overwhelming attribute of corn silk.
and do you see also like how language? I mean, it's really interesting. The other thing this is getting at is, to me, I hope there's something people can take away, experientially, right? Is like, do you see how like, actually, when Jeff said the word paint, right? Actually, what happened in your mind?
It changed.
What's that?
It changed.
Yeah, your experience somehow, right? And it does, doesn't it? Because which is how and what this school. I mean, you can see how this school is very deeply analyzing and getting at something about our way of perceiving, right? And the connection between language. I mean, definitely the school. I mean, if you just start to contemplate your own experience in relation to what the school is saying, right? You can't help but have a different, where you start to notice how language and terms, right? Terms and concepts. We say this. Either I don't know what's the right word. Influence is too small a word, actually, in this sense, right?
Define.
Create.
Yeah, define or create or construct. I don't know what the right term is in English. Like how to get it. I don't know. It's hard to get it correctly. Your perceptions, right? And that you never have this is the interesting one, right? And that you never have a perception. Ordinary people, right, never have a perception that's not like that. That's not where the object seems to be established by way of its own character as the referent to our concepts, and terminology. Right? And I want to just say too, like, and you get the flavor. This is what I hope people can take away. One is that, it's interesting to differentiate it from the middle way school. That would be an interesting topic. But But for this school, like, just staying with that, so one is that issue of language, and another is that idea, because I think it's very important, is like, from the, certainly from Lama Tsongkhapa's point of view, he says it very clearly, it's very important, is this idea that, and that the realization, as I went back to, again, like it's a philosophical term, but I think it's a good term for now, is a non-affirming negation, right? Whereas, so what he's getting at there is not something philosophical, it was something experiential, right? Which is that when now I'm going to make it something more concrete. I mean, well, that was pretty concrete, but take, take the example of, take the example, like we're near Washington, so take the example of, if you see somebody who's like the most, whatever your political affiliation is, right? I don't care what yours is, right? But say you're driving and somebody cuts you off badly, right? Where you almost have an accident. And then you see that they're plastered with bumper stickers that are the most extreme possible bumper stickers expressing the exact opposite, the most extreme opposite view of your political stance, right? And they just jammed on their brakes and you almost hit them, and then you look up, you're looking, then you're like, notice them particularly. Yeah, you're already looking, hopefully, but you look more carefully and you see it's like plastered with bumper stickers that are the, most extreme, again, like the far, far, far extreme of any view that you don't have, right? And think of how you feel, like, and what comes up, right? Like that sense of them, right? And for sure, right? They appear by way of they appears to you as if they exist by way of are established by way of their own character, right? As factors imputed in the memory of entity, in this case, a lot of attributes that you're projecting, right? I'm just giving you a concrete example, right? You're projecting all these attributes, right? And it's for sure it appears as completely separate. Like that, it seems like that perception of that person, right? For sure, there's a big sense of separateness of subject and subject and object, right? And what this school's getting at in the non-affirming negation is that perception you're having, right, of them existing, right, as the referent of all those concepts and as a separate substantiality is what? They're empty of that. And actually, that's true. What's tricky is, like, ordinarily, in ordinary perception, sometimes Buddhists would say, well, you don't even know who they are, they may have borrowed the car, right? This is saying, even if they didn't borrow the car, they're empty of that. Right? They're empty of what you're, right? Doesn't matter, like, whether they borrowed the car or they didn't borrow, right? Like, from one point of view, an easy way to say it is, well, it's the child of that person and they didn't even, right, well, then of course they're empty. This is saying, no, if they're the person who put every bumper sticker on, who jammed their brakes on purpose in front of you because they don't like you, they're still empty of that, of what you're, what's the way to say it? Of being established by way of their own character as the factor imputed the meaning of entity and attribute that you're imputing there, and they're empty of existing as, and that object and subject are empty of existing as separate substantial entities. So like I said, I'm just trying to give a flavor for, like, a more applying this in daily life. Like, can you imagine that? They're empty of that. Did you?
No, but no, go ahead. Because you said you project the attributes. I thought the attributes was there. So when you say the chair, the chair is the entity and it has the attributes, like purple or whatever. But we're not projecting the attributes.
Actually, so I'll read the term and then I'll say it in my own terms. So what this is saying is, other powered natures, right, are not established by way of their own character as factors imputed in the manner of entity and attribute. Is what it's saying. That's the actual quote from Lama Tsongkhapa. So, in a way, what it's saying is, like, if you analyze that, right, what it's saying is that, like, for sure, chair is a term, right? Is a term, and purple is a term. And that both of those are terms, right? So one is the entity is chair, and an attribute would be purple, right? In this case, and so what this is saying is, like, so as soon as I perceive the chair, I perceive it as being established by way of its own character as the referent for purple and the referent for chair, but it's actually empty of being established by way of its own character as the referent for the term chair and the term purple. And it's empty of both equally, actually. That's really it. Which is tricky, because in this school's perspective, but it does exist inherently, and it does exist from its own side, conventionally, as a conventional truth.
Can you define inherently in this context?
Inherently means usually inherently in Buddhist philosophy would to put it simply would usually means like from its own side.
Doesn't that get at dependence again?
Dependence in what sense?
That it's dependent on something.
Yeah, no, it does. And in this school's, but remember, from this school's perspective, this is actually, I don't know if you remember this, in Lama Tsongkhapa's text, praise to the Buddha, praise to dependent rising, right? He says in that, remember, because you were there at the retreat, right? Lama Tsongkhapa says in that text, he says, when he's praising the Buddha for teaching dependent rising, right? And he says, he's talking about really, from the perspective, he's talking, that text is very clearly from the perspective of the middle way consequence, the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the middle way consequence school's view, right? And he says there, he says, I don't remember the exact phrase, the exact terms, but basically what he says is that, he says, dependence, right, which is what you're raising, and he says, what uniquely in the middle way consequence school, in the Prasangika view, dependence is the sign of emptiness of inherent existence. He says, all other schools, even Buddhist schools, no, he's not talking about non-Buddhist, he's the Buddhist, non-Buddhist, of course, but he's saying even all other Buddhist schools actually take dependence as a sign that things are inherently existent.
Right.
And so he's referring to other schools as well, but he's including, the mind-only school be included in that. That in other words, that from the mind-only school's perspective, that which is dependently arisen is inherently existent. It's only the middle way consequence school that would say that's which, only the middle way consequence would say this, that what's dependently arisen, even conventionally lacks inherent existence. Only the consequence, only the middle way consequence school would say that even conventionally it lacks inherent existence. But the mind-only school says that which is dependent, right, which is other-powered natures, are inherently existent, and are truly existent, and do exist from their own side. But they're not established by their own character as factors of the matter, entity, and attribute. So it's interesting, right, to differentiate. I know we got to stop in a minute, but and I guess what I'm just saying, I just want to say this too, like if you feel confused about those, if you're really interested in emptiness, in other words, and you feel confused about those differences, good. In other words, that means like, that's like the sign, right, that you're like, do you see now why, if you don't study this school, for example, right, and then actually, if you really want to study the middle way consequence school, you have to also understand the difference between that and the middle way autonomy school, Bhava Viveka, right, which is even more subtle difference than this one. This difference is actually not as subtle as the difference between those two. So like my point is not like it's not that it's great to be confused, but it is great to be confused in a way, because if we don't get confused, right, and say like I don't understand the difference, then like good. In other words, then we'll in other words, that's the, because then you can start then you know what to contemplate, right? Well, okay, if I can understand that difference, then I'll be closer to understanding the actual intent of the Buddha, right? Which is why, why else would Lama Tsongkhapa explain all these, right? Like another Lama. I mean, why do they explain it? Why does the Dalai Lama explain these things, right? Ultimately, the goal is to realize the actual intent of the Buddha, right? The actual meaning of emptiness, the ultimate, final, definitive meaning of emptiness. But if you can't even understand if you can't understand those differences, right, then you're having some vague. Then when you refute something in your meditation, right, when you sit down to meditate on emptiness, actually to use a metaphor for a moment, right? Like when Jushri, right, here's Lama Tsongkhapa, is holding a sword, right, and this symbolizes, right, cutting through ignorance, right, the cutting off of ignorance, right. And part of the point here, I think, is this: is like, I mean, Lama Tsongkhapa's sword there is very sharp, you know, and sometimes I think my sword is like more. I look at it and I think, oh, it's more like a baseball bat or something. You know, I'm knocking ignorance over and over, but it keeps getting up, and you know, because my sword is like about as sharp as a baseball bat. And I think these things are like, you know, like if I imagine like one of those, what you call it, like a spinning wheel or something, you know, of stone where you keep touching, and it's slowly getting sharper if you keep doing that, right? So that you can eventually cut just through the ignorance, right? But if you don't sharpen it, again, and now can you see why? I just want to say this too. Like at the beginning of his text, I'll just say this last thing and then we'll stop. At the beginning of his text called how do you say Essence of True Eloquence. Right? Lama Tsongkhapa says. He points out. He says that many people, you know, and he praises them actually. He says many people who are very good meditators, who are very good practitioners, and so on, didn't understand the final meaning of emptiness actually correctly. In other words, they did many other good things, and they were good meditators, and that, but they didn't get that final view of emptiness correctly in their meditation, which, you know, was not. It's not like a criticism. It's not that they didn't try. But I guess part of the point is like. So it's not so easy, actually, right? And so one has to kind of keep contemplating these things, I think. You know, well, that's what Lama Tsongkhapa seems to be saying, right? Is that one has to keep contemplating these from different points of view and from different schools, because otherwise one won't come to that definitive understanding. And I'll say, and what Lama Tsongkhapa really points out is that one has to do all those things, though, actually. If you really want to understand emptiness, you have to both you know, study fairly extensively. You can see why if you just go off into a retreat having read one book, like you're not going to understand emptiness, right? Like it's not how it works. And then one has to do often do retreats too, you know, and purify and accumulate good karma, and then keep contemplating, and eventually those come together, right? You purify your karma, you accumulate merit, you contemplate, and you study, and then eventually those come together, and you have a definitive experience of some kind of review. Right? And otherwise, they say it doesn't happen. So that's, I guess, the method. But any final comment before we start?
So is the real difference here between the two schools, I mean, the question that's forming in my mind, I guess, is how can things that are dependent exist from their own side?
Yeah,
That's the thing I have to answer, basically.
Yeah, you have to answer that. Yeah, you have to answer that. Actually, what's good is to really contemplate that deeply, right? Right, because I mean, that how can somebody think how can somebody, on the one hand, and say it again though, how can exist from...
How can things that are dependent exist from their own side?
Well, actually, let me give one metaphor, and then like just that I think is interesting for that. You know, there's a traditional metaphor of a snake and a rope. There are many, many Buddhist texts, right, where you say, right, the person like is out and it's like dusk, and they take a step and they're right next to something, and they see something coiled there, right, in the grass, and they jump and run away, right. And there's a common metaphor for emptiness, right, where then, you know, somebody comes out with a flashlight, and you say, oh no, I left a rope there, and they shine it on it, and then you see, oh, it's a piece of rope, right. And then you realize, oh, it's empty of being a snake, right? So, and that's like a metaphor, right? So that rope is definitely not a snake. It's empty of being a snake. Phew, I'm relieved. And similarly, when you can realize you're empty of, right? Like, what's interesting, I'm just raising it as a question to you, right? Like, then let's say you go out and the person shines the light, and you don't see a rope. You see something slithering through the grass. So is that a snake from its own side? It's a snake, right? Is it a snake from its own side or not? It seems like you have to. In one way, you have to say, well, it's not a rope, right? So it is a snake from its own side, or is it not a snake from its own? And the question is not, is it a snake? Right? That's obvious. It's a snake. Right? The question is, if it's, you know, so they sign the rope and it's a rope. Phew, it's not a snake. That's obvious, right? But if you sign a snake and it's slithering, right, and it's got mottled color and it's moving, right, then is it a snake from its own side or not? I'm just raising that as a question. Like, it's the same question you raised, but I'm just raising it in a different way. Or it's a similar question to one you raised. Anyway, we'll get into that. So we'll get into more another time. But let's dedicate the merit because we're over. can just take it like, may the supreme jewel, bodhicitta, that is not arisen, arise and grow. May that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And we can particularly dedicate, may all of us, and all other beings, as vast as the vastness of space, realize bodhicitta, and also realize the correct view of emptiness. And thereby be liberated from the oceans of samsaric suffering. May we all, and may all then liberate countless others. By this virtue, which is empty from its own side, may I, who am empty from my own side, achieve the state of Buddha's enlightenment, which is empty from its own side. Lead all sentient beings who are empty from their own side to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible, which is empty.